Hello there, I'm Guildmaster Dan, and welcome to the Fourth Wall. Now, sometimes as a game master, you end up finding yourself with an idea for a game that centers around something that you like, such as maybe political intrigue or adventuring on the high seas, and you run into the issue where you're trying to come up with, how do I work combat in here? I want to run a game that's about the intrigues in a royal court, or about sailing and the adventures you have, like with weather and with sea monsters. But how do I work combat into these? Like, do I work assassins into here and maybe duels and things, or sea monsters that attack the ship, or like pirates? How do I work in these encounters? Well, the question you need to ask yourself is, do you really have to? Today, we're going to be talking about running non-violent games. Now, early on in my career as a game master, I used to think that a balanced session consisted of at least one combat to go along with whatever role-playing was happening. And now that I've, gained some more experience, I've come to determine that that's not the case at all. That a good game doesn't require combat at all. When I run campaigns, I often find that I run several sessions in a row where there's been absolutely no combat, but the characters are still doing things, and the players are still invested because the story's still moving. The characters are still there adventuring. They're just not getting into random fights for the sake of having fights. And that's kind of what we're looking at today, is the fact that if you're going to run a non-violent game, if your interest is in a different aspect of a game, if it's primarily in role-playing, if it's in the political intrigue of a court, if it's in sailing and seeing the world, if it's in just exploring the wilderness and seeing what's out there, or if it's in solving a mystery or solving crimes, you don't have to have combat. There is a notion that conflict is equivalent to combat, and you cannot have conflict in your games, and thus dramatic stories, without having combat involved. And that's just not true. Look at your own games. You'll find that if you have a leaning towards role-playing, if your table is role-playing emphasized, you will find that you have less and less combat in sessions. And ultimately, you need to accept that not every game is for every player. I've said that many times. Now, just because you're interested in running a non-violent game doesn't mean that all your players might be. You need to accept this early on, that what you want to run is a non-violent game, that your interest as a game master is to run this sort of game, and find players for that sort of game. Now, maybe your current set of players might be interested in doing that. You just need to be upfront and tell them what you're interested in doing. Not all of them might be. They might want to sit out and come back at the next session, or come back at the next game that you run, rather. You just need to be upfront and express this, or seek out players who are actively interested in the same thing as you are. The very first thing you need to do is accept that you're interested in running a non-violent game, and that even though violence may happen, and even though that there may be combat going on in the story, it's not the focus of your game. The focus of your game is the core experience you're trying to get, whether that's intrigue, exploring, whatever. Once that you've decided that you don't want to run a violent game, that you want to run a non-violent game, decide what your focus is on. So we're taking the focus off of combat. Combat is not where the exciting stuff is going to happen in my game. What do I want to focus on? Okay? Political intrigue, exploring. What aspect do you want to focus on? What is your entire game going to be themed around? What is the role-playing and the drama going to be centered around? Once you do that, you need to set your expectations early. As I've said, be upfront with your players, or seek out players who, even if you seek out players who are interested in this sort of game, be upfront about what you're trying to run here. When you're running the game and the person says, I want to play a fighter, I'm like, well, this game isn't really about fighting, so a fighting character is not really going to fit in. We're going to be doing political intrigue, so there's not going to be any duels or anything going on. There's no real combat involved, so a fighter won't really fit in. Like, oh, okay. Well, can I be a doctor? Sure, you can do this or this and this. point is, you need to set that example early, that you're not running a game that's going to be focused on combat. Combat is going to be pushed to the side if there's any at all. So your players need to be interested in a sort of game where they're going to be playing non-combat related characters who have things to do that aren't related to punching someone in the face. Now notice what I say there, that the combat, if there's any, will be pushed off to the side. One of the biggest hurdles that you might come across is just being so used to running and playing in games where combat is thought to be a necessity, that you can't run a game without combat. When you try not to, you gotta accept that violence is a fact of life. Violence happens. You know, assassinations exist in political courts. Pirates exist. Just jerks who are willing to throw a punch at someone for a stupid reason exist. So your players are bound to run into a situation that will involve violence. It's just not the focus of the game. So it needs to be de-emphasized in the way that you would de-emphasize something that wasn't a focus in a combat-oriented game. For example, if you're running a group of soldiers in a just standard game that you would see, if you're running a group of warriors, adventurers, who come into town and they have to talk their way out of something. A lot of game masters out there, if they have players who don't have the gift of gab, that aren't good at coming up with that role playing out, might let them do a roll to see if they succeed or fail and ask the player to describe, okay, well, how did you succeed or how did you fail? Or they might just say, go ahead and roll. Okay, you talk your way past the guard. What do you do now? See how that weakness of the game is de-emphasized. It's kind of just pushed off to the side. It's dealt with quickly and moved on so that you can get back to moving on with the story. It's the same way with combat. You might have somebody who gets angry at one of your players and, starts throwing punches. Well, that's fine. Either just describe it away and you get into a fist fight and you both tumble on the ground, you both come away with it with black eyes, but you end up going your separate ways, just angrier at one another. Or you both get into a fist fight, tumble on the ground until finally the guards come, and now you find yourself locked up in jail. He's not around, what do you do? Or even resolve it with a single roll. Okay, you get caught up in a fist fight. Go ahead and make a roll. Okay, you end up taking some licks, but you end up defeating him, and he's dragged away off to prison because you were found not guilty of starting the fight. What do you do now? It's just de-emphasized. Combat may be there, but it's not the focus, so you shouldn't linger on it. You shouldn't allow it to drag out your game. You should get it past and move on to the important stuff, to that political intrigue, to the talking, to the exploring. Just get it done, move it out of the way. It's just not the focus. Similarly, something that came up on the Brigade that somebody had that was a suggestion was you can run into situations where you have combat going on around you that you're not involved in. The example that was used was you're dealing with going into a combat scenario, but your group is non-combatants. You're trying to accomplish some task. So the powers that be give you a set of warriors to keep the enemies off of you. So while you're going about doing your task, you hear the sounds of combat around you while the combat NPCs are off dealing with that combat part. So now, as you're doing your task, combat, even though you're technically in it, has become more of a environment. It's something that's going on around you. It's just details in the atmosphere around you, rather than you being involved in the nitty-gritty of, okay, I need to roll for initiative because the NPCs have to each move in No, we're not going to let it drag out like that. We're going to do the important bit while the combat around us may occasionally come back to be described, just so we can get a sense of pressure of what's going on and give us a bit of a time limit, keep it exciting. And that's really the thing that you need to remember when you're running a non-violent game, is that non-violence does not mean no drama or excitement. You can have high drama scenarios. You can have exciting things happening in your game that have nothing to do with getting into a fight. You've seen these in games already all the time. a crumbling temple that's starting to like just fall into the earth around you unless you get out in time. Plagues that hit regions where everybody's paranoid of everyone else because the plague is airborne or communicable by touch. You have disastrous weather. It's very exciting and dangerous to be caught in a hurricane while you're trying to do something else. Like, say, you're trying to escort your family from one side of the city to the other while, wind is blown up and there's waves and you're just trying to get your family or your friends from one side of the town to the other. Or kind of like what I was describing before with that scenario of your non-combatants in a combat, war as an environment. Like, war is going on, your city is under siege, so you may occasionally have things happen like a cannonball comes flying over the wall and smashes into the wall next to you while you were trying to cut a deal with a member from the opposing guild, or soldiers break into the city, so you're cut off from a part of the city, so you're not able to make it over to the other quarter where you were supposed to meet with your contact that was going to give you the next clue in the investigation. War can be going on. Combat can be happening in your game in order to build excitement or tension, and you aren't involved in it. It's over there. It's background noise. It's just stuff. It's just details there to add tension, a time limit, or excitement. You can have exciting things happening in your game. You can find high drama and excitement in a non-violent game. You do not have to be in a combat to find excitement. You can have a high-tension scenario in a court where everybody is prim and proper and no weapons in there whatsoever just because the stakes involved are so high. You are a prince of a kingdom that is at war with the kingdom you are in at the moment, and you were trying to broker peace because your father has been captured by this kingdom and is about to be executed, and you're trying to argue to please do not kill your father. He is a symbol of your people, and your people will only revolt if he's killed, and you don't want to see any more bloodshed. Very high stakes, very exciting, and there's no combat happening. Even though there's a threat of violence, that is not the focus. The focus is you pleading your case to the opposing king. You can have exciting, dramatic moments without combat. And ultimately, you just have to remember that you have a certain focus to the game, and that's what you're going for. Combat is not that focus. Combat is maybe a detail or maybe a skill check that you come to at some point. And sometimes you'll come to a hurdle where you think like, oh, well, this would normally, in a normal game, this would immediately turn to combat. Two people are arguing in a tavern. This is going to turn into a fight. And now I got to think of a way around the fight. No, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can have cases where you have opposing people ready, they're butting heads, and it may look in normal case like this would normally lead to a fight. But remember, sane people don't go from argument to fist fight right away. Normal people don't draw guns or start throwing punches just because you did something they disagree with. Sure, those people do exist in the world, absolutely. But those are not the norm. Normal people don't instantly go to punching when things don't go their way. Violent people go to punching when things don't go their way. And we've already established that this is a non-violent game that we're playing in. Thus, you get into an argument. Sure, it becomes a very heated argument that would normally lead to combat. That doesn't mean we're dealing with two people that are going to start throwing punches. No, what that means is you've made an enemy. You're both fuming and stuff. He's going to storm out, and now you have an enemy out in town that's ruining your repertoire, is going to close off avenues for you in the future. There are repercussions to conflict, to interpersonal conflict, that are different than just getting into a fight. And that is the main hurdle you need to get over, is once you've accepted that you're running a non-violent game and you come out to those scenarios, take heart that it doesn't have to go to combat. just because you have a conflict doesn't mean it has to be settled with combat. It may have repercussions, but that doesn't have to be physical violence. The last thing I'd like to touch on when talking about running a non-violent game is that these sorts of games tend to reinforce or tend to reward cleverness for players. They tend to focus on players being creative, getting around social scenarios or obstacles that require them to think about it, and not just get to the other side in the fastest way possible, as you might find in most combat-oriented games. So, for example, I remember I once had a quest being assigned to my party in a D&D game, and my character took, okay, all right, so we need to get this done. Who do we need to kill to get it done? Now, granted, that fit for his character because he was literally a sellsword, but that's kind of the scenario that you tend to see happen a lot in combat-oriented games, is I'm giving you a quest, this is the person you need to kill to accomplish what I need done. That's not the scenario here. We're talking about a type of game where it's, okay, I need you to get this done, so you need to figure out how to do it. And you're playing all non-combatant characters, you're all either intellectuals or scientists or mages or thieves. You know, you're not going to just charge in as one of these things and, you know, get into a fight and overpower the enemy and then take what you want. No, you're going to think around it. Okay, there's a big bad in the way, and I need the shiny thing behind him. I'm not going to get into a fight with this big bad because, you know, I don't want to get hurt. I have too much to live for. I don't want to hurt him. Maybe this big bad is actually a good person. It's just I need what's behind him. I don't want to get into a fight here. How do I work my way around it? Okay, well, either we need to distract him and get him over here, or, you know, we need to get the NPC fighter to distract him with getting into a fight, get what we need, and then create another distraction to get him out of there. Look, you are in a scenario where you're dealing with non-combat scenarios, and you get up to that scenario where, say, oh, well, this is going to end up having to be solved in a combat. You know, they're going to have to make the roll. I'll describe it by, but they're going to have to do it. Maybe not. Maybe they do come up with a way to, maybe they walk straight up to the guy, which you think, okay, this is going to end in combat. They're not supposed to be here. This guy's aggressive. And the player starts talking a really good game to this guy, talking about how he's not, you know, he's really taken for granted by his masters, that I'm sure he doesn't really get paid well, that, you know, while he's doing this, his girlfriend's off with the master over there. I just saw them. You can go look for yourself. And you know what? The guard listens to him because your player's being creative. Your player is coming up and actively trying to think of a non-combat way to get past this, which wasn't what you expected in the first place. This is the sort of game that you need to let your players be creative and try new solutions that you didn't think of. Don't railroad your players into, oh, there's only one way past a scenario, one way past a situation. If they come up with a creative way to get around it, let them do it, because you're working in a type of game that is indicative of cleverness. You want to encourage cleverness because it just means your players are going to be more invested in the game and more interested in getting around those combat scenarios or getting around the obstacles that come to them. You're dealing with non-violent characters, and thus you're going to be dealing with characters who naturally think a little bit more about things. Encourage that. Don't discourage it. Let them do what they want to do and work with them on it. You don't always have to give them what they want. Say him trying that might lead to different complications, like he goes over there only to cause problems for one of your party members that are over there, but you let them try it. You let them be clever, and now they have to be clever about dealing with the new consequences of their scenario. Pretty much, you're dealing with a non-violent game, so let your players be clever and encourage them to be clever. Reward them for being clever. Now, granted, you don't see a lot of non-violent games all the time, and thus there might be something that I might have missed. Admittedly, I have not run completely non-violent games very often, but from what I have run and from what I've heard of other people, this is the advice that I wanted to bring to you guys. So certainly, if I missed something or if you disagreed with something I had to say, please feel free to leave a comment below. Please like, share, and subscribe so we keep the conversation going. Please check out our Facebook channel. And then also, I wanted to stop and thank you guys because we are on our 50th episode of The Fourth Wall, and we're almost at 300 subscribers, and I'm just ecstatic because the channel is doing so well. And I just want to thank all of you guys for sticking around with me, for talking with me and Guild Mouse, and just generally being awesome, awesome people. Thank you for sticking around with us. I hope you stick around with us for another 50 episodes, and hell, maybe another 300 subscribers. So thank you guys for watching. We really appreciate all that you do for us, and we'll see you guys next time.